This video is brought to you by my supporters on Patreon. Hey guys, I'm here with a video showing you how I made the pauldrons for my Tyrande cosplay. To start off, I drew up some patterns and then transferred that to EVA foam. The EVA foam, the size that I'm using in this build or for the base of these pauldrons, is 6mm EVA foam. And you can find these templates up on my store Envy and Etsy if you happen to need or want them. So I didn't record me gluing the two pieces together. Either that file's lost or I just forgot to record that. But all I did was glue two sides of the pauldrons together so that now it's one whole pauldron. And at the place where they connect, or that top middle seam, I cut that at a very slight angle and glued those together so that they would attach at an angle and attach and be sitting the way that you see here. Once those were glued together, I just dremeled down that seam to smooth it out because it was a little bit rough looking. After I sanded out that seam, I hit the entire armor piece with a heat gun to warm it up so that the foam became more moldable and shapeable. And I'm not even sure if that's a word, but I'm going to go with it. Anyways, I did that so I could then better shape the shoulder to look more like her actual shoulders. Because if you didn't realize, they were kind of like flaring out and looked a little funky. So I used the heat gun to help round those out a little bit more and look like how I wanted them to. Make sure to take care when working with hot foam because it sometimes can get really hot and you can potentially burn yourself. Also work in a well-ventilated area or outside because the fumes aren't that great for you, and wearing a mask is also obviously recommended. So right here, I'm just cutting off an extra piece that I had attached to my armor still that I had forgotten to trace on to my pattern originally and cut that part out because she just has this cutout on the sides of her pauldron. And so this part's totally irrelevant to the overall tutorial or whatever aspect of this video, because if you're using my patterns, this is obviously included, and if you've drawn out your own, hopefully you haven't missed this piece either and have to go back and cut it out. Not that it's that big of a deal, but I just wanted to explain why I'm doing this and why you probably won't have to do this. Now it's time to add the details for her shoulder pieces, and to make these details I am using these EVA Foam Bevels that I got from Cosplay Crafts. So the bevel sizes that I'm using is 10mm and 20mm. I have a link to the Cosplay Crafts site, which is where I bought my bevels from, down in the description box below. If you do end up buying your supplies from that shop, I encourage you to use my link because it does help me buy future supplies and it doesn't come at any extra cost to you. It's just if you're going to buy from there, why not buy from there using my link so that I can build more cosplays and make more tutorials around said cosplays. Anyways, back to what I'm doing in the video. So what I'm doing here is using contact cement to glue down all of my bevel pieces onto the armor, and I'm just measuring out the pieces as I go since these have some pretty sharp points to them, I guess is the best way to put it. I am cutting all of my bevels when I cut them at an angle so that the bevels will kind of like flow together and look like it might have just been one long bevel. Unfortunately, these bevels are so thick that I can't just bend them into that shape and put them at an angle because there's too much foam there for that to happen. So I have to cut them at an angle, glue down that piece, then cut the other piece at an angle and connect the two together so that they come to like a nice looking corner, and then continue on and do the same every time I reach a corner. You will hopefully be able to see what I'm talking about throughout the video. Different clips you'll be able to see the angles better that I'm talking about and the corners where the two bevel pieces have to connect. For all the outer edge of her armor, I'm using 20mm EVA Foam Bevels. And for all the inner details, I'll be using 10mm EVA Foam Bevels. And this was simply because they are a different size on her reference photos, and it also saves space because 20mm was not going to get all that detailing into the center of her armor. There's just not enough space for 20mm EVA Foam Bevels to fit in there. All products are different, so when working with contact cement or whatever glue you are using, read the instructions on your bottle to figure out how to use it. When it came to placing the bevels over the end of the pauldron or the tip of the pauldron, I just bent the bevel across that point rather than like cut it off and then glue it back together and continue on. I didn't find the need to cut it at any sort of angle because it bent pretty easily over this without getting like too puffy, kind of like it was doing with the areas where I had to like make it fit in a corner. That I didn't have that problem at the tip of the pauldron, just as a heads up. Once I finish the 20mm bevels around the edge, I moved to doing the 10mm bevels in the center of the armor. And when attaching these and when attaching really any bevels, you're going to find that you're going to need to usually cut all of the edges at an angle. That angle depends on which piece you're attaching it to. So when I'm attaching it like straight on directly to another bevel piece, I'm going to have to cut it downward so that the top point, like from the top point of the bevel edge that is going to be facing outwards or on top, it's going at a downward inward slope, if that makes any sense. Basically, you just want it to blend into the other bevel piece. So if you cut it just straight up and down, you're going to find that you're not going to really be able to attach it to the other bevel piece because the other bevel piece is slope. So you're going to have to make it match. You're going to have to make the two slopes line up with each other, basically. It doesn't have to be perfect because EVA foam is flexible. So if it's like not the exact same angle, you can still maneuver it a little bit. However, if it's straight up and down, you're going to find it a lot more difficult and tricky, and it might end up pulling away. The easiest way I found to do this was when attaching the foam pieces together. I would just line my scissors up with the slope of whatever bevel that I'm attaching, the bevel that I'm currently attaching to, and cutting the edge off that way. And then you got a slope that pretty much matched up. Some of the bevels on her armor won't attach to another bevel piece, instead they'll taper to a point. And I'm going to have an entirely different video that will show and totally better explain what I'm about to try to explain without really being able to show you how you do that. But in the meantime, what I do to make these bevels that have this weird triangular shape to it into a nice pretty point is basically just trim off the two bottom corners. So I keep the top corner, whatever's going to be the top corner, and then I cut away most of the foam that's underneath it, but do so in a way so that it comes to a point. So you're gonna trim off like the right side of the triangle and kind of curve it so that it tapers into the rest of the bevel still, rather than looking like a weird just sharp edge. And then you're gonna do the same with the other side, and then you'll glue it on, and hopefully that made enough sense. I will again have a video that better shows this later, but basically you just want to cut it into a pointed shape. So once all of those bevels are attached, it is time for some of the finishing touches before moving on to painting. And that is dremeling down all of the edges and any really rough seams. So what I mean by the seam lines are any place that you attach bevels to each other might need to be sanded a little bit to kind of even those edges out and smooth them together. This will help a lot in the priming process. And of course, I Dremel around the edge of the entire pauldron pieces, like both of them, to smooth that all out so that it's nice and pretty and smooth looking. After all that sanding, I coated my pieces in a couple layers of wood glue. I did about 5 layers, but anywhere but between 3 and 7 should be good. I wanted to try to get these to be as smooth as possible, like super extra smooth compared to some of my older pieces. So to do that, I used a sandable spray paint primer and coated both my shoulder pieces in that, and then took a piece of sandpaper and sanded that all down to try to smooth out any rough edges and any uneven texture. There are tons of other things out there that will do the exact same thing. I, for example, used to use Bondo's gap filler and still do, but since this was such a large armor set, I wanted something that would coat pieces very quickly, and so I opted for a sandable primer instead. After that, I did a few more coats of that primer only because the base of her armor is white. If her armor was a different color, I would have went with a different colored spray paint or spray paint primer, but I figured since I had a bunch of this specifically for this build, I might as well just stick to using that, especially since this white spray paint primer was like the most opaque spray paint I've been able to find so far. A lot of the times they take tons and tons of coat until that white is actually white. Tip for when you are trying to paint something white, opt for a matte white paint rather than a glossy white paint, and if you need it to be glossy, just add a glossy clear top coat on top. The matte white paints tend to be a lot more opaque and require less layers. After that white base was down, I started adding shadowing, and to do that I used an airbrush, but of course you can do this by hand. And forgive me, I'm going to say this ahead of time, but this was my first time using an airbrush was on this build, so if I'm doing something wrong or it looks a bit funky and not that great, that is because I'm still learning. So anyways, I started adding in that shadowing, and I opted to go for this greenish blue color because her armor, it is white, but it kind of has this greenish blue tint to it. So I wanted to somehow represent that and decided the shadowing would look best. Also, it kind of looks like that's the color the shadows are on her armor if you look at some of the reference photos. And when I found myself making some big mistakes, I went ahead and just loaded up some white paint in my airbrush and kind of erased those mistakes because the airbrush white was also pretty opaque. Once that green shadowing was laid down, I used painter's tape to mask it all off so that I could focus on painting the bevels. And to paint the bevels, I once again used my airbrush and I used a metallic silver color. So because I was learning to use my airbrush as I was doing this, there was times that I would accidentally layer on the paint too thick or was too close, so it just kind of went splurting out a lot of it at once and it made the paint almost clumpy. So I would just take a paper towel and pat that down to remove some of the excess paint so that it could dry smoothly, and then brush over it again with the airbrush later after it had dried to smooth out the paint. I topped everything off with a coat of glossy clear spray paint, but because I felt like it needed something more, I decided I was going to add in some even darker shadowing, but just around the very inner edges of the white spots in her armor. So where we had did that green, I went in with another tealy green color, but a little bit darker than the airbrushed green color that I had applied, and lined around the edges with that, then used a different paintbrush that didn't have any paint on it to blend that out into the green. You can also mix a little bit of water with this acrylic paint, that's what I'm using, to help you blend it better. The water and acrylic paint method can also apply to blending in the lighter layer of green that we did earlier if you aren't using an airbrush and just painting the entire thing by hand, which is what I normally do, so obviously there is no shame in that. I did this just because I felt like the armor was missing something, and I decided to see what this looked like. If I ended up hating it, I knew I could repaint it in the future, which would be a hassle, but I'd rather see if I liked this better first or not, and I ended up liking it better, so there wasn't really any time lost. Sometimes I forget how to speak. So one of the last things I did was make these flags for her armor and then glue those into place. These flags, or like the making of these flags, will be in a different video, so I'm not going to go too much over how I did that yet, but they will be covered in a video, don't worry about that. Anyways, once I did have these flags made, I used contact cement to glue those onto her armor, and I tried to line them up as evenly as possible so that they were in the same positions on both sides and the same heights on both sides, although it's not super perfect because I don't use like measurements and stuff like that. I just like to eyeball things. But if measurements are your thing, totally is cool to do that. And that finishes that up for this video. Hopefully you guys have found this video helpful, and stick around to see the rest of the videos for this entire build. Thanks for watching. Have a lovely day. Bye!